Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And Laura actually gave a little bit of the background on what I've been doing since graduating from NAU. So I figured just to start with just a couple, and is this giving you some feedback here? All right. I figured just to start with just about 5 slides, letting you know where I've been. I had dinner with Pete Foulet last night, and he asked me, how long ago did you graduate from NAU School of Forestry? And I was like, wow, it's actually been a decade as of this year. So I worked for ERI for a year after graduating, and then I totally switched biomes. Brand new biome for me, working in deserts at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas for 7 years. And like a lot of people these days, I was 100% grant funded, so I had to come up with my own grants for my own salary and any graduate students and staff. So I had an opportunity in 2012 to take a position with the National Park Service, a Washington, D.C. office based in Fort Collins, and an absolutely great experience for me. Ultimately, I really wanted to get back to doing my passion, which is on-the-ground conservation projects and really seeing things happen. So in 2014, I started a new company, Natural Resource Conservation, LLC, something I would never have imagined that I would be doing. So I kind of have to really know the ecology, but also really know the business side and tech structure and so forth as well. Here's just a couple of shots. This was our research building at UNLV. Our lab was up here, and you might be able to see back here, that's the MGM and the Luxor over here. We probably had one of the most unique views of any research lab around, so I really enjoyed that. And here's me with some graduate students and undergraduate students doing some revegetation work along the Lake Mead shoreline. So a few of the projects that I'm working on now, I'm very excited to start a new project just outside Las Vegas with Clark County. And this surprises a lot of people, but right in Las Vegas, in eastern Las Vegas, it's actually quite heavily forested. They've done a lot of revegetation work and basically reestablishing cottonwood and willow forests. And here's an example here. And this is actually a burned area that burned in March of 2014. And believe it or not, some of these top-killed cottonwood are now 15 feet tall. So these trees have been growing about 2 feet a month, so pretty amazing. And I'll be helping them really try to understand kind of a better reference condition, justification for some of the work they're doing. This is one historical photograph we found of a cottonwood forest in downtown Las Vegas that's now covered by numerous casinos, but a lot of water there at that time. So I'm very excited to help them develop a fire management and vegetation management plan. Another really interesting thing was I left the federal government, so my paycheck there's no paycheck for me on the horizon here, and I'm thinking, when I get back to Vegas and what have I done? Am I going to need to start gambling at the casinos here for some income? And literally the day after that, I get an email from Kuwait, and I had been talking with them about 3 years earlier and just kind of fizzled. And they messaged me, and they were like, would you like to come back and work on implementing a big United Nations restoration project in Kuwait? And I was like, absolutely, I have nothing else going on. I would love this opportunity. So I've been over there 2 times, and it's kind of a mixture of restoration that they're working on. A lot of it is stemming from the 1991 Gulf War when Iraq invaded, and a lot of their oil fields in Kuwait were burned, and there was a tremendous amount of ecological damage. And what they have done so far is establish a network of protected areas, and this is one back here, and a very clear camel grazing effect where there's literally nothing out here, and some pretty good vegetation inside, so that's where we're focusing a lot of our restoration efforts. And this is myself and some colleagues in Kuwait. This acacia tree is actually one of the only trees that was spared in a huge swath of their desert during the Iraqi invasion. This is an oil area. that still has, obviously not revegetated at all over the last 20 years. So they're still working on it. Amazing potential there with all kinds of native plant farms that they have and so forth. A very different situation where here a lot of times our restoration we're limited by native seeds, and that's definitely not the case in Kuwait. Definitely a different world over there. It's been a very interesting cultural experience for me. This is Starbucks in one of their high-end malls, and it's actually so high-end that they have waiters and waitresses in the Starbucks, and you can basically get a gourmet meal there too that they serve you. And you basically can't order in Arabic either. The whole menu is in English, so it's been very interesting. So that's just a few of the projects that I'm working on currently since graduating here. So on to the main attraction of today. This was a project that originated in collaboration with ERI, and our intent was to do an overall synthesis of what are the effects on the understory of manipulating the overstory and implementing prescribed burns, and also the effects of wildfires. And so this was actually just published about 2 weeks ago in Forest Ecology and Management, and it's up on my website, so you're welcome to freely download a PDF with the appendix, and there's also a fact sheet on the ERI website as well for more information. So a good part of my talk will be based on this paper. And I'll start off by giving a little bit more background on mixed conifer ecology, because many of us are probably more familiar with ponderosa pine forests, and probably a lot more uncertainty with mixed conifer forests. So I'll talk a little bit more about reference conditions and so forth. Then our research questions and how we synthesize the literature to address some of those questions, and results and management implications. So one striking thing when we were beginning this project was there were very few definitions of mixed conifer forests out there. One of the few was in this recent GTR that Andrew Sanchez-Metter was a co-author on, and they produced a very nice definition, and I actually really like this diagram showing kind of the progression along elevation from PJ to ponderosa pine to mixed conifer, but different scenarios in terms of topographic positions and so forth that you can have mixed conifer forest. And again, they gave a very useful definition for the Southwest, and this was extremely rare to even define mixed conifer forest. Most publications would just start and just say mixed conifer. Well, if we take that literally, PJ, pinyon juniper woodland, is actually mixed conifer too, right? There's two coniferous tree species. So, we need to be more specific for our project, where we also were west-wide, going all the way from Mexico to Canada. For example, this is a mixed conifer forest in Olympic National Park that had very frequent fire. So our definition needs to be able to encompass that diversity of forest types. So this is what we came up with, and I think it can be subject to revision. But 2 or more conifer tree species, essentially in inland, intermountain west, but including some of the coastal ranges, generally of semi-arid climate. So that's what we came up with that fit pretty well what we were trying to do in our project. So here's a map. The gray here throughout is mixed conifer forest, and we see here some in northern Arizona, again California, Sierra Nevada, some down in the coastal Southern California inland ranges, and then all the way up to Alberta and British Columbia. A lot of mixed conifer up in that part of the world that had pretty frequent fire. Again, there's mixed conifer in Mexico, but we did not have any studies in our particular analysis. So each one of these numbers is also a study that we included in our analysis here for your reference. So we were interested in understory vegetation, one reason being as a fuel, and importance of livestock grazing is certainly a land use in a lot of these areas. Certainly wildlife habitat value, invertebrate diversity, and the plant layer here in mixed conifer forests is where a lot of the biodiversity is. So that was one of our guiding questions. And also, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of uncertainty with mixed conifer forests, just in terms of their fundamental ecology and how they respond to treatments. And one example of that was Agee's classic 1993 Fire Ecology of the Pacific Northwest books. And he actually called mixed conifer forests the most complex set of forest types, in his opinion, up there. And given the sheer volume of fuel they can have, one of the most challenging forest types for fire management. So just for your reference, here's a couple examples of mixed conifer forests across the West. This is in the Spring Mountains in my part of the world, just outside of Las Vegas, in the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest. This is in the San Bernardino National Forest near Big Bear. The two trees in the foreground with kind of the white furrowed bark, that's white fir. This here is incense cedar. And then in the back, that's our well-known ponderosa pine, but there can also be Jeffrey pine in a lot of these ranges as well. And again, these are only 4 or 5 of the potentially 25 or so tree species that can occur across the overall range of mixed conifer. This is all the way up in Banff National Park. These are some burn units in mixed conifer forest that are actually not that far below tree line up in this part of the world. So, again, in terms of our definitions, around Flagstaff, a lot of times above mixed conifer we have spruce fir forest. And that's, not the case up there where essentially you can go directly to tree line. So, in terms of reference conditions, a little bit less well known than ponderosa pine, but once you really start digging into the literature about what is known, there's a lot that's actually known and some very well done repeat photographs studies. This was a great one in the Sierra Nevada. I was actually just talking to John Venkat earlier about how challenging it is to get some of these repeat photos. And to me, it's amazing that people have been able to go back and get photos from the 1860s and repeat them today. This is one example from Yosemite Valley, very open forest here in 1866, and 100 years later, we see a lot of those openings have closed in. This was some photographs that the Forest Service gave me. This was a Sierra Nevada mixed conifer stand, 1929. A lot of shrubs in the understory, very open. Here's the rock, and then here's that rock about 80 years later. Virtually nothing on the forest floor except for litter and woody debris, hardly any plants, and extremely dense conditions. And so, what we were finding is yes, you can have mixed conifer forests, perhaps especially the moist mixed conifer forests that can have longer fire return intervals on any particular spot. But a lot of mixed conifer forests were burning perhaps as frequently as ponderosa pine forests around Flagstaff. Some fire history reconstruction studies were finding a 2-year historical fire return interval in mixed conifer. And yes, others perhaps were on the orders of decades, and maybe some small patches of crown fire, but maybe not. But point being, in these types of situations, these mixed conifer forests have not had any type of fire for over 100 years. So pretty dramatic changes resulting from that. We also should remember effects of grazing. A lot of these areas have been grazed for a very long time, and so forth. Just want to draw your attention. This was a really interesting study. I don't want us to take the time going through here, but in Sequoia National Park, where one of our studies there was a really neat study published recently reconstructing fire history for a 2,000-year period, taking advantage of the long-lived giant sequoia trees. And so there's some really good references such as this out there to help guide us. And so our research questions that we were very interested in, we wanted to address our primary question of how do tree cutting and fire affect understories of mixed conifer forests. And these cutting treatments were not necessarily restoration cuts. We had some silvicultural treatments from the 60s that were very useful in certain areas. Some were done strictly for fuel reduction. And then we certainly had some fairly strict restoration cuts in there as well. And the same thing applies to prescribed burning. So we were basically interested in, what are the overall effects of manipulating the understory and fire on the understories of these forests? And so our 5 specific questions, our first one was, do relative influences among these treatment types of cutting and prescribed fire and wildfire differ? And we specifically called wildfire a planned treatment in our analysis because, I think we know now that it is a likely inevitable outcome of passive management. Actually, in fact, passive management could actually be our most intensive active treatment these days in these forests. And secondly, we wanted to know if the response of the understory is related to time since treatment. Third, we wanted to know if different understory plant groups differed in their responses. So do native versus exotic species differ? Clearly a lot of interest in exotic species. And fourth, we were really interested if we could differentiate responses between moist and dry mixed conifer forest. And fifth, we wanted to know whether specific aspects of treatment, such as amount of basal area removed or season of prescribed burning, whether that can affect the understory response. So our approach was to use a systematic review. We did not collect any new data as part of this study. We went out and tried to find the existing published literature to synthesize to address our questions. And in a nutshell, what systematic reviews do is they use a repeatable procedure to gather published literature and then specific criteria for whether or not you include or exclude a study. And so here's how we did that. We searched several different databases, and we used a series of keywords, such as fuel reduction and tree thinning and prescribed fire and understory. And from that literature then, we required that studies be, of course, in mixed conifer forest, as well as in some type of published outlet, a journal article, Forest Service publication, conference proceeding, and that they provide some type of quantitative data on understory response to our treatments of interest. And we did require that they include before-after treatment designs or have some type of control, untreated control, as a basis for comparison. In terms of analyzing these data, one thing that was very interesting with collaborators, we had a lot of discussion about how to proceed. We have all these studies that we had gathered, and we entered the data from them into a database. And one avenue for proceeding then is to actually do a full-blown statistical meta-analysis. And some of you may have heard of that or even have done your own. You don't have to apply a meta-analysis to information gathered through a systematic review. And we did not in this case. I've actually done about 10 of these systematic reviews, and it's never worked out for me to apply a meta-analysis for a number of reasons. When we're dealing with these types of applied management treatments and wildfires, a lot of times you don't have the replication that you might desire. Sometimes you can't even report variability, for example, if you're just have one wildfire that you're studying. And in our case here, and I would suggest this to any of the undergraduate and graduate students when you're working on your data, because I still do this. I just graphed the responses out very simply. And here was one example of what we got a lot. So this is 6 studies, and this was a response value of the understory over here. And it was very common to have 3 positive responses where the understory increased. And then on the other flip side, 3 studies of the same treatment where understories had declined. And so if we calculate an average, this is what we get. And that never actually occurred in nature. These average out to 0, no response. But that's not what we want to be analyzing in terms of calculating averages. So we adopted a hybrid approach that was very quantitative. We ranked the different responses in these treatments. We just did very basic but highly quantitative scatter plots to look at time since treatment effects and so forth. So that's what a lot of the figures that I'm going to show you today are based from. So it doesn't matter if you can read the specifics here, but just some of the, in point being, we had columns of the different studies, and we summarized the treatments that were done. We summarized what types of plant responses they measured, the types of data that each study provided. We had another table that had the climatic conditions during the study. Any supportive information that we could find, we included and created this database for. So moving into the results, we found a total of 41 published studies that addressed our study questions, and they were reported in 50 articles. So there could be more than one article per study. Pretty good geographic distribution. There were 5 studies in British Columbia, and then 7 states in the US, 16 in California being the highest, but there was a fair number from other states as well. And also a pretty good distribution in terms of the different treatments as well that were analyzed. And some studies could analyze more than one treatment, like comparing, say, prescribed fire versus tree cutting. And some studies actually could have applied both, so thinnest-stand and then follow that by prescribed burning. So moving into the results, our first question of what are the relative influences of these treatment types of cutting and burning on understory vegetation? And we found pretty mixed results in terms of the plant abundance, and this could be plant cover, it could be biomass, frequency, whatever study, whatever measure they reported, we used, and then we calculated a treatment compared to control abundance ratio. And we found that about half of studies of cutting and prescribed fire found increases in the understory, and about half found decreases. And I'll talk about some potential reasons for this. Our second question, how are responses related to time since treatment? This was very telling in our opinion. So what we did here was just graph out time since treatments here on the x-axis, and that treatment to control ratio on the y. And each one of these dots is a study. And so this column is for plant abundance. And cutting up top, just want to draw your attention to the fact that all 5 studies that were longer than 5 years in duration reported increases, as in a value, treatment versus control value above 1, which means increase. And anything below this line means decrease. Prescribed fire, both long-term studies also found increases. And if we move to species richness, the number of species per area, clearly this line here is driven by that one long-term study point. So obviously we would very much like to have more long-term data than we have, but again, it's pretty telling that all 7 studies that measured responses for longer than 5 years found increases. One of my favorite studies in this data set was a study by Webster and Halpern in Sequoia National Park. And here, they're actually able to implement prescribed burning without first doing mechanical thinning. And we know that that's not always the case. Many of these stands and areas, basically be very unsafe to just go ahead and prescribe burn really almost under any prescription in the fuel loads that we have today without mechanical treatment first. But here they were able to do that very effectively. And so just in highlighting some of their results, one first key point is that after their burning, tree density was reduced substantially, and that reduction persisted throughout their 20-year study period. Okay? Here is plant cover, again, as a function of time since treatment. And what's very interesting is the plant cover in the burned area only differs from unburned at the 10th year. and then it proceeds to further diverge and increase. So any of these measurements here below 10 years would have found no significant difference between treatment and control after burning. And it was only in the 10th year that this difference in understory was detected. And this also applies to species richness and the other measures that they measured as well. This was just one example here. And so this is pretty significant. It kind of makes you think, we need to remember that these are, still semi-arid forests. And so one thought is, we do this treatment, and, maybe it's going to take a particularly moist year to actually have understory stimulated, perhaps. That's just one idea. And maybe that occurred sometime between their 5 and 10 year study period. That's just one thought here. I'll talk about some other potential reasons why as well. So our third question, do different plant groups, such as native or exotic, respond differently to treatments? Starting here with shrubs versus forbs versus graminoids, which are grasses and sedges, this is very important. Shrubs can be very important browse for certain wildlife species. And of course, a lot of ranching applications really like to see a lot of the grasses doing pretty well. In general, we found that forbs and graminoids responded a little bit more positively to treatments than shrubs, but there was a lot of variability here, and maybe not enough studies for us to really definitively answer this question. And it could partly depend on, what are the actual species in these study areas. Again, we're talking about an area all the way from Canada down here to Arizona. So there's a big difference in the species pool as well. So probably a little bit more work could be done on this. And non-native species, again, of keen interest. We did find, in general, that after treatments, non-natives did increase, especially after prescribed burning, and especially so after cutting plus prescribed fire. The two pluses, that was our ranking. I don't really want us to worry about that here in our talk, but what that meant is within a study, the cutting and prescribed fire applied together had the greatest overall increase in non-native plants. So that's something for us to be cognizant of, but the really good news is in almost all studies, even after doing cutting and prescribed fires together, the flora was almost always 90 to 95% or more still dominated by native species, which had also increased substantially. And we also need to remember too that wildfire can have a dramatic influence on plant invasions. We had some studies that were able to address this in our data set, but we actually turned to research from ponderosa pine forests as well, and a lot of variability. Some wildfires, very low levels of invasion, such as the Hayman fire in Colorado. Others, extremely high levels of invasion after wildfire. This was a picture I took recently. This is cheatgrass, just a sea of it coming in after a fire near Big Bear and mixed conifer forest. So question 4, dry versus moist mixed conifer, and this gets a lot of attention in terms of variability within this broad forest type, and we actually were really disappointed that we did not find a single study that had compared the response in dry versus moist mixed conifer forest after treatment. So we were really disappointed with that. One thing that we did try at least was to take the average climatic condition of a given study site, so not just what occurred during the 3-year post-treatment period, but the 50 or 100-year climatic average, if we could get a hold of that in terms of average precipitation. And so we said, well, can we at least see if areas that are maybe moister had a different response than drier regions? And we actually found very little relationship with that either. And that, I'm not surprised that there wasn't a whole lot of relationship. What we're really probably more interested in is situations down here, do different slope aspects that can have very different fuel structures and productivities. That's probably the level of analysis that would be most useful for managers that we really want to address. So we view this as one of the top research needs, to really understand this variability and try to understand how this might help us with our project planning. So for treatment intensity, this was a very interesting thing. For example, there was one study in British Columbia that had thinned. They had done a basal area cut and had thinned very heavily, but over a 15-year period, some of their moderately thinned units actually had an overall increase in tree canopy cover, such that by year 15 there was very little response overall in the understory. So it was pretty illuminating for things like that. And overall, what we found is that tree canopy cover had to be reduced down to pretty substantially less than 50% cover. Otherwise, you just didn't really get a very good understory response. And that reduction in tree canopy cover had to be fairly persistent. And I'll talk a little bit more of that in just a little bit. And first, I just wanted to run through just a couple slides, just showing some repeat photographs from some of the sites. One aspect of this review that I really enjoyed, that was probably my favorite part, was, we get all these published studies, when you read the author's paper, and you're like, what are they really thinking, in terms of what happened? Did they revisit some of these sites? They report their 2-year results or their 3-year results. Did they go back and after 5-6 years? That's maybe not in the published paper. And so one thing that we did is we emailed as many authors as we could still track down. And I was actually very heartened by the response that we got. We had over 12 authors of the 41 studies that were willing to email us back and actually correspond with us about their findings and share further information as well as photographs, which I was really appreciative of. And I encourage people to, when you're doing a review article like this, there can be a lot of other information out there that it's just not showing up in the published paper. So we found this to be extremely valuable. And this was one example. This was on the Lincoln National Forest. Up here is before treatment, and this is a white fir, Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, very dense stand, very typical of what we have. And this is 1 year after thinning, which incidentally, their paper only reported the 1-year response, and we see virtually nothing here. So you read the paper, and you're like, oh, geez, nothing really happened. But here's just one of the photos from 2 years later, and so on. He was able to provide a few more. By about year 4, the understory had a pretty substantial amount of cover. Same thing here. Here's another one of their study plots increasing. So very valuable information here. This is one. This is an ERI study from Grand Canyon National Park. So the left here is just a couple of the unburned photos there. And then this here is what the burned understory looked like about 6 years after fire. This was part of the Fire and Fire Surrogate Joint Fire Science funded projects that initiated in the early 2000s with a specific goal of reducing the overstory to be able to support certain fire characteristics under certain fire weather. So their goal was not restoration or anything, strictly fuel reduction. But some of the outcomes were extremely good ecologically. Up here is untreated control, very dense, a lot of fuels, very little understory vegetation. This is a thin only, so opened up quite a bit. This was a burn only, pretty mixed results actually in terms of both the fuel reduction and the understory response. And this was the thin plus burned, where they first thinned it and then applied prescribed burns. And one really neat follow-up that I'll talk a little bit about more is the author of this study also pointed out some species that they only were getting just on plots that had been both thin and burned. So very valuable information here. So some of the key points that we're hoping that people take away is that we did find that post-treatment declines in the understory were very common right after treatment. And we really don't want people to get nervous about this, though, especially if you're trying to do these treatments from a biodiversity standpoint or even from a grazing management standpoint. And some of the reasons why we felt that some of the understory response could be slow at times after treatment, one reason was slash. And this was a project in the central Sierra Nevada. This slash is actually up to a foot deep or more. This is a major challenge. We know slash disposal is a major issue, especially for mixed conifer forests that can just, again, have tremendous fuel loads. Not a whole lot of good alternatives. You know, we can pile and burn it. There's issues with soil sterilization there. You know, we can just leave it scattered on the forest floor. You know, if there's fairly low slash loading, that can be possible. But you know, basically what we've done is just transferred a lot of that fuel from the overstory now to the understory, and there's some disadvantages to that. We can, you know, chip it up. There's also some disadvantages to that as well. And you know, transporting it off-site usually is not practical. So again, we did turn to some research in ponderosa pine, where slash management has been researched a little bit better than in mixed conifer forests. And in our paper, we did give some suggestions in terms of how these different alternatives of slash disposal might influence understory vegetation from an understory perspective. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the key findings was, the treatments really needed to substantially reduce the overstory. You know, we can't really be messing around here. You know, we need to thin these forests pretty substantially if we want to see an understory response. Because remember, you know, after we treat these forests, you know, the trees don't stop growing, right? I mean, now they have a little bit more open conditions. Their canopies are going to be expanding. So very quickly we can have overstory conditions that perhaps are not much different, or maybe even worse than they were pre-treatment. So one thing that we turn to is literature from undisturbed forests, where people had gone out and measured understory-overstory relationships in unmanipulated forests. And so this was some of the very useful information. This was from up in the Blue Mountains in Oregon. This study found that once overstory canopy cover exceeded about 50%, the shrub cover went down to almost nothing and declined substantially. Same thing here with the total herbaceous production. Again, a threshold of between about 36 and 50% overstory canopy cover, and we have very substantial declines. And here in the Southwest and in places like the Front Range in Colorado, these relationships are actually around 30%, 30 to 40% overstory canopy cover, and you just get very low amounts of understory production. So, you know, what we have going on is a system dominated by trees at the expense of other components of the ecosystem. And, you know, again, this situation of understory cover, cascading effects to wildlife, invertebrates, and so forth. Another factor was grazing. Some of these treatments, basically right after they were performed, perhaps had livestock back on them. And, you know, sometimes, depending on, what the local grazing management is, there may be no help for that. But, you know, we were trying to suggest that whenever possible, if grazing can be deferred after treatment for at least a few years, that may enable the understory to recover from, frankly, a lot that we put it through. You know, it's been under very dense overstory and fuel load conditions for over 100 years. And then we hit it with a treatment that might generate a lot of slash or burning that, you know, by definition is actually removing plant biomass. And then if we turn around and hit it again with very intensive grazing, we might want to avoid that if we can. And, you know, we also need to remember that there's a lot of other native ungulates out there eating things too. And so here were just two examples. This is a long-term study that did not meet our criteria in terms of actual thinning and burning for a couple reasons, but we use it as supporting information. And plant biomass after thinning and burning was about 2 times greater over a period of 27 years in Oregon mixed conifer. Very quickly, after some pretty intensive treatments in Sierra Nevada mixed conifer, about 3 times the plant cover in areas that were not grazed. So this is definitely something to look at, and there's actually some pretty good literature out there, some pretty good long-term studies that are very useful for us in terms of project planning. We also really try to think about, where are the seeds going to be coming from? And, we have this understory that's usually pretty depauperate, right? Again, after the period of 100 years, potentially, of fire exclusion. And we open up the canopy. Well, to get a response, what do we need? We need to either have stimulated the seed bank and have stuff coming up from the seed bank. We need to have stuff blowing in, other seeds blowing in from outside, or perhaps the vegetation that's already there, we want that to be expanding or resprouting, such as after fire. So we very much tried to collect as many soil seed bank studies as we could. This is from some work that actually Judy and I had done earlier in Spring Mountains mixed conifer forests in southern Nevada. And we found, kind of mixed results in terms of the seed banks of these forests. The good news was they were dominated by native species, which is consistent with the above ground vegetation findings that we found in our review in terms of these treatments being dominated by native species. But we also found that in terms of comparing across ecosystem types, the seed bank densities in mixed conifer forests, based on our study and others, they're not large. They do not have that many seeds stored in the soil seed bank. So this, again, could partly account for why some responses could be a little bit slow after treatment the first few years. One really interesting finding that we thought could really benefit from some further research, and I know, I think Mary's still here. I know this will excite her very much. We found through, really it was about 7 studies that consistently found this, literally all the way from British Columbia to one in New Mexico. So this is a very consistent finding across the broad region. We found that you would get certain species after prescribed fire or wildland fire use that you just did not get after thinning alone. Thinning alone was very beneficial for the understory overall, as we've shown. But there was just a subset of species that you just didn't get unless you actually added prescribed fire to this. And some of the names even, fireweed here, perhaps not surprising. Some of the others, some epilobium and cryptantha, these were species that in a lot of studies, if they just did thinning, they did not appear. So very, very interesting. And the overall model that we developed for how understories are responding to these treatments was that treatments don't appear to eliminate any species. There's very little evidence that you do a treatment and you have species from the understory disappearing after treatment. That really did not occur. But you gain a lot of species, such as some of these after you do prescribed burning. And again, we felt that overall our conclusions, were really very supportive of doing tree thinning and fuel reduction and prescribed burning in these forests, and that they're probably going to benefit certain disturbance-oriented native species like those fire-dependent species in the short term, and then benefit the overall understory in the long term. And again, we felt this provided very much support for actively managing these forests from their current condition to avoid what we felt are pretty undesirable outcomes, such as what I'm about to show you here. This was a ponderosa pine, white fir, mixed conifer forest in my neck of the woods, Spring Mountains of Las Vegas. And I took these in 2009. Just want to draw your attention here, a fire scar here. This was riddled with fire scars. So clear evidence that there was a dominant component of surface fire here. And then this is what it became. Very sad. This was about a 30,000 acre wildfire that occurred in 2013. And I went back to these sites, and the understory was not that great. Before fire, there was reasonable, maybe 10% cover, but again, a lot of trees. But unfortunately, after this wildfire, a year after, there was virtually nothing here. There's a few of these little green things are actually non-native forbs. And walking around, the soil's kind of got that really weird kind of powdery feel to it. So this is a real problem, not just from the overstory, obviously, but understory-wise, we have a situation now that is probably going to be pretty difficult for understory plant colonization. So again, we've gone from this to this situation here. And this is, again, another reason why we've been calling wildfire, a planned treatment here. So about a third of the mixed conifer forest has now been lost just from this district, just in this fire. So here, I think I will stop to give us about 15 minutes for questions. I really want to thank the ERI and collaborators with the ERI for working with me on this project. And again, I really want to give a big thank you to the 12 authors of those studies that were willing to respond and share. And actually, that's the whole digital photo library is an appendix to our paper. So you can get that through the Forest Ecology and Management website or my personal website as well. And I think ERI has that on their research library too. So a lot of different ways you can get this paper if you'd like to read more. So with that, I think, do we have a little bit of time for questions? All right. Good question. Really good question. Not really. And, that's one of the kind of these operational aspects of treatments that, I mean, we know how it is. So many different variables can affect the response. And there's trade-offs between, how long you wait until burning. And so to answer, the short answer to your question is no, people did not. I mean, it would actually be pretty useful to set up a study where you do thinning and then you actually defer, burning, maybe a certain number of years and actually test that. And, one challenge would be you might have different years climatically, and that can have a huge effect. But that would be, perhaps part of your study that you're trying to assess. So that's a great question. And the answer, most of these studies did report that in terms of time, afterwards, but they didn't specifically test it. So, good question. Anything else, or everybody just wants to get to Beaver Street? All right. Well, again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I think there's a grad student Q&A after this, and. Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much.